Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's July 16th, 2026. We're going to start with a few appetizers before we get to the main course. In previous recordings, we have had a tendency to introduce what is putatively going to be the first topic that ends up, on account of our long-windedness, or on account of my long-windedness in particular, ends up consuming the better part of an hour, and so we end up just sticking with that topic. So I'm going to make a concerted effort to put the smaller things up front and save the main course for a little bit later. So with that as a brief introduction, apropos of the recent Supreme Court ruling on the birthright citizenship case, the economist YouGov ran a survey of the public asking about favorability of the 9 current Supreme Court justices. The index that I created here takes the percentages of those who self-describe as conservative, who view justices favorably and assign a positive value to that, and the same is done with liberals, except a negative value is assigned to the higher favorability rating. And so what that means is the higher the score, the more conservative the general public, both conservatives and liberals, view a justice, and the lower the score, the more liberal or leftist they judge that justice. And we are often critical of the public's lack of information on a whole host of things, but in this case, I think the general public does a pretty good job of pegging the Supreme Court justices on the ideological spectrum. Before running the numbers, I ordered it with Thomas as the most conservative, followed by Alito, then Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Roberts, Coney Barrett, which, parenthetically, if a woman has 2 last names, then almost definitionally she is not particularly conservative, even though Coney Barrett was appointed by a Republican and, without giving the game away, probably is considered by most of the public to be a conservative. But then after her, it is Kagan, then Sotomayor, and the most leftist liberal in my rendering was Wakanda Brown Jackson, another double last name. Before we go through the Economist YouGov results, Jeff, how would you personally rate them from most rightist or most conservative, traditionalist, however you want to characterize it, to least traditionalist or most leftist?
My ordering is exactly the same, with 2 possible exceptions. I might rate Alito as the most conservative, and then Thomas. And then I also might put Amy Coney Barrett as more conservative than John Roberts. But both of those are very close. And it also depends a little bit on how you define conservative exactly. And I don't think we want to get into the weeds on that.
Well, the way the public renders it, Thomas is the most conservative at a positive 115. Kavanaugh is rated as the second most conservative at 101. Alito is third at 90. Gorsuch is fourth at 86. Roberts is fifth at 72. Coney Barrett is sixth at 52. So those are all positive numbers. All 6 of those justices are pretty overwhelmingly perceived by the public to be conservative. And then the last 3, Kagan as the least leftist of the leftist judges at negative 62, Sotomayor at negative 85, and Wakanda Brown Jackson at negative 92. And if you had been asking, well, what about the case where conservatives, self-described conservatives and liberals both view a justice favorably or both view a justice unfavorably? Perish the thought, there is nothing remotely close to that with these ratings. They are overwhelmingly dichotomous in that all of the conservative justices, people who self-describe as conservative, have massively favorable opinions on, and all of the leftist judges, the 3 leftist judges, are overwhelmingly favorably viewed by self-described liberals and unfavorably viewed by self-described conservatives. There's a little bit, as that score layout shows, there's a little bit of difference among the conservatives in terms of how strong the support is among self-described conservatives, and how, correspondingly, how much ire leftists, self-described leftists, have for those conservative justices. But the grouping is very, very clear. And so this is a pretty good indication that as we've said before, and certainly aren't the only ones who have, that the Supreme Court increasingly is resembling a mini legislature, and the general public is quite privy to that reality, because if the system were operating the way that it was conceived of operating in the beginning with the Constitution, then you would presume that we would have a situation where there might be really highly respected jurists who are favorably viewed by conservatives and liberals and independents, people across the political spectrum. But that is not at all the case.
Since 2000, about a third to somewhere between a third and a half of U.S. Supreme Court cases are unanimous or near unanimous. The 5-4 splits are the minority. So it is the very close, contentious ones that get a disproportionate amount of attention, but for the most part, most cases are pretty unanimous. In the most recent 2025-2026 term, 44% of the United States Supreme Court cases were unanimous. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they agree on every aspect of the case, but as far as the judgment, the bottom line judgment, 44% were unanimous. Having said that, it is the 5-4, 6-3 decisions that tend to get the most attention, and I think that probably distorts some of the public perception of their view of. I would guess if you asked the general public, they would say, oh yeah, almost every case, if not every case, has that same partisan divide, whereas most cases actually, or many, if not most, actually don't have that divide. I think a lot of the fault can be laid at the feet of the legislature for not acting. We're in a situation where senators and representatives often go out of their ways to not have to put their neck out, stick their neck out to make a difficult decision. They oftentimes prefer to kick the responsibility to the courts, and maybe not so much in the U.S. Supreme Court, but in my experience in the justice system in the United States, judges are not looking to micromanage people and get involved in cases and make decisions. They often would very much prefer that the parties work out. This is more on the civil side, but they're very happy and encourage the parties to work out an agreement themselves. They are not, again, in my experience, looking to exert their authority and micromanage people's lives. And so that gets to another point. I think the more local, if you ask these questions on a more local level, if you ask people how they feel about their district court judges, their local county or municipal court judges, I would guess they would have a more favorable view and a less partisan view. And I think it's likely that a Republican would have a positive view of a Democrat appointed judge, or vice versa. And that's just the nature of the decisions that are rendered by, usually the more local the decision is, the more local the judicial officer is, the less partisan their decisions tend to be.
Yes, that is worth noting, that the plurality of cases are unanimous and the majority are lopsided, with usually just one or two dissenting voices among the 9. I am currently asking the AI package to ferret out the number of cases that have ideological splits both among conservatives and liberal justices on the same case. There are many cases, like the birthright citizenship case, where you'll have all of the left on one side and then the right will split. And then less frequently, but there are probably also cases where you'll have all of the right on one side and then the leftist justices will split. I am inquiring about the number of cases where there are putatively known as leftist and rightist, or conservative and liberal justices, who the coalition on the assent and the dissent both include conservatives and liberals on both sides, because that would be the real test of an objective, well-functioning judiciary in the way that the founders anticipated the judicial branch, what its function would be and how it would operate. as we let the AI cook there, we will move to another topic. And for that, I'll need to put on my tripart hat here. The idea that America is becoming a socialist country. We went a couple weeks ago over some public polling data that showed massive public support for government funding of housing and education and healthcare. And those are three pretty big industries, pretty big pieces of the economic marketplace. If the government paid for your housing and your education and your healthcare, I mean, you'd be left with discretionary spending on your cell phone and your car, what you eat, maybe 20%, 30% of your total economic expenditure would be paid for by you and not by the government. And so even if the terminology, even if there is a negative association with socialism, there is definitely popular support for what socialist policies would look like. And coming just a few weeks off of the 250th anniversary of America's declared independence, that really does illustrate the truth in the aphorism that the past is a foreign country. Because if we look at the grievances laid out by those who wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson and company, there is not a single complaint listed about what the government back home in Great Britain, in England, is withholding from the colonies. There are no obligations in terms of government resources expended on the colonists that comprise any of the complaints at all that are listed. Every single one is the assertion of a negative right being violated. Not that the crown, that King George isn't providing housing or healthcare or education or anything else for the colonists. It's all about things that the government is preventing the colonists from being able to do. Even in the case of the merciless Indian savages, the complaint there is that the government in Britain is getting involved in contracts with those Indian tribes that are then giving the Indian tribes the green light to attack the colonial settlers without the colonists being able to have any input in the way that those treaties are being hammered out. And that is just such a drastic contrast to the complaints that we saw in that public polling previously. And if we think about today and current year, what are all of the complaints about the government? It's all that the government doesn't give us enough X, Y, and Z. It's not outside of libertarian circles that represent 0.1% of the population complaining about what the government is restricting people from doing. It is that the government owes us these things, the government isn't giving us these things, and that is the nature of all of the grievances today, which virtually every grievance is so diametrically opposed to the nature of the grievances at the country's initial founding.
A strong case could be made that the founding generation of America was the greatest generation of men in the history of the world, certainly in the West. So inevitably, we're going to fall short being compared to them. Today, the most, at least right now in 2026, the most obvious, intense public displays of protests are against ICE detention, ICE operations. Just this week, there were shootings in, I believe, Houston and then up in Maine. And there have been major protests against ICE officers. And so that is something that would be sort of, in a way, in line with what the founders were protesting against, the heavy-handed arm of the British Crown, that the founders were asking to be left alone and for them to be left alone in peace and let them handle things. And I guess in a similar vein, the people in Maine, for instance, are saying, get the federal government out of here, get the ICE officers off the street. We can handle this. These are our communities. You don't need to be coming in from the outside and telling us who is allowed to live among us in our community.
Yes, fair point. I wouldn't argue that in current year, the exclusive emphasis is on in terms of grievances with the government is based on the government failing to deliver the Gibbs. I think it is the majority of the frustration with the government, though, is it not providing these various things that we saw in polling a couple weeks ago that the overwhelming majority of the public would like the government to provide. But there are still some instances of government oppression that draw some protests today. I think in the past it was exclusively those instances of perceived government heavy-handedness and oppression that started a revolution, whereas today, even with something like the ICE protest, while they are somewhat high profile, if you look at public polling, there is 4 or 5 times as much emphasis on economic issues as there is on immigration issues. It does motivate a set of people to be pretty vocal about perceived overreach by the federal government through ICE. But in terms of what actually motivates people to vote, it's going to be economic issues more than things like immigration enforcement. And it's worth pondering, too, that at the time of the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party ostensibly started over something like a 3% excise tax on tea. At the time of the American Revolution, colonists paid between 1 and 2% of their annual incomes in all forms of taxation, whereas today the average American pays between 25 and 35% of their income in taxation. And the government today is much stronger, much more economically influential, orders of magnitude more so than it was 250 years ago. And yet, even though the government is much larger and much more powerful now, the majority of the complaints against the contemporary government, the contemporary state, is not that it is too heavy-handed and too oppressive and intrusive, but that it doesn't do enough. 250 years ago, the government was teeny and it got in our way too much. 250 years later, the government is gargantuan and involved in everything, but it's not quite involved in everything enough. The next topic, also related, has to do with an assertion that someone we view favorably, Kevin Deanna, has made on multiple occasions recently in the wake of the birthright citizenship ruling, that the right will get its people in positions of power. That is, 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices were appointed by Republican presidents. But even though they get their people in power, once in power, the managerial state takes over, and those people end up doing the same thing that the broader globo homo leftist state does. And even in the examples that he could think of that were somewhat contrary to that, notably on gun rights, which is the one issue, if there is one, over the last 25 or 50 years that the political right has largely been victorious on, it is gun rights, and the other one being abortion in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But even in those rare cases, in particular with the case of abortion, Deanna's assertion was that the pro-life organizations and leadership are the most open borders, anti-immigration, restrictionist elements of the right. That struck me as an incorrect assertion. I looked to the General Social Survey to evaluate it, and looking from the year 2000 to 2025, so the last quarter century, and looking only at self-identified Republicans, I cross-referenced support for or opposition to abortion and support for or opposition to increasing immigration. Among self-identified Republicans, 31% are pro-choice, 69% are pro-life. But among those who want an increase in immigration among Republicans, 47% of those Republicans who want an increase in immigration are pro-choice, compared to just 53% who want an increase in immigration being pro-life. So another way to look at that is pro-choice Republicans are about 50% more likely to be open borders than pro-life Republicans are. And so on that general metric, Deanna's point is rendered pretty inarguably incorrect. Although in his defense, he was, I think, talking about the leadership class in the pro-life movement, the organizational heads and the like. And I think that gets to a broader observation about how across the board, no matter what the institution is, no matter what the putative cause is, the managerial state and the people who populate it or aspire to populate it all broadly think the same about a whole host of issues, have the same cultural affinities and the same universalistic and liberal beliefs outside of the one in particular issue that they may be in their position of authority to champion. Outside of that, their belief system is going to be largely indistinguishable from that of the rest of the managerial class. The high status positions all bundle together. Those are all culturally leftist, libertarian positions on things like homosexuality and abortion, immigration, and all of the conservative traditionalist positions bundle together on the low status end of things, which are things like being pro-life and being pro-borders. And just because a member of the managerial class is ostensibly leading one of these lower status institutions, the pull to have the correct beliefs on all of the other things that have so much influence on status in modern society is stronger than any residual desire to be in solidarity with the hoi polloi on the other issues that the managerial member is not ostensibly in position to represent. And one more brief subject, one more brief appetizer before we get to the main meal. Henry Nowak, the English man who was butchered by a very non-English Sikh. Jeff tells me that Nowak, at least his dad, is Polish. Well, in any case, Nowak was a European, and the Sikh who butchered him in the street is emphatically not European. It has come out now in court documents after the fact, after the case had concluded, that Nowak's literal last recorded words were, "I'm not a racist." John Darbyshire regularly used to make the point that the overwhelming problem with the modern Western mindset is that we would collectively rather be dead than be thought of as being racist. And in this case, it is literally spot on. As Nowak is bleeding out, as he is dying, he is protesting that though he is dying, he is not racist. And so the moral of the story one might glean from that is that Western man has a choice. Either he can be called a racist and survive, or he can protest that he is not a racist as he is wiped from the face of the earth and the future.
Now for the main course, we're going to talk about the Tyler Robinson legal proceedings. I was looking back at the Reality Taboos archives and the Charlie Kirk killing in September 2025 and all of the aftermath. That is the most covered topic on the show. There's been a major development in that case in the form of the preliminary hearing, which is a probable cause proceeding. That wrapped up. It ran from July 6th to July 10th. I'm going to give just a very brief background on the case. If you recall, Charlie Kirk was killed on September 10th, 2025. He was 31 years old, founder of Turning Point USA, and he was killed giving a talk in front of 3,000 people at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. So Ness and I look at this case a little bit differently. I tend to trust the official narrative in this case. I like to think that I look at every situation on an individual basis, and that I certainly I try to apply a healthy dose of skepticism to the official narrative. But in this case, I just think that the story that we're being told is essentially true, at least as Ness likes to say, looking at things through a glass darkly. I can't detect any sort of obvious fraud, unlike a situation, we'll get into this in a minute, and sort of a meta point about how alternative media is looking at this and comparing this situation to others like COVID, for instance, in which in my view, the lies and deceptions were crystal clear and obvious. And it's essentially the skeptics of the Charlie Kirk case who don't believe the official narrative are pointing to COVID and say, look at what the government said about COVID. They were lying then. How can you be so naive to believe what they're saying now? And that's a fair point, and we're going to get into some of that. So we've spent episodes discussing some of the irregularities, some of the claims that opponents of the official narrative are making, the inconsistencies that they're pointing out. And so a few I want to address right away. We have discussed before the bizarre spectacle of the 71-year-old bystander named George Zen, who at the time of the shooting approached an officer and confessed, "I shot him, now shoot me." He was then arrested for obstruction of justice. And then allegedly he then claimed that he wanted to be a, quote, martyr for the person who was shot. And then apparently in the process of being arrested and questioned, his phone was seized, and he was then evidence was discovered of sexual exploitation of a minor. And then in February of 2026, he pleaded no contest to the obstruction charge and guilty to 2 of the 4 exploitation counts. So maybe call me naive or gullible, but I'm willing to essentially write that one off as just a weird, bizarre little quirk. This guy was apparently known in the community for making a spectacle of himself. So yeah, I mean, I'm certainly willing to address that. I'm very open to hearing what that means, if there is more to it than just a kooky old guy doing that. But I try to be empirical and go by the evidence. I haven't seen anything that indicating it's...
Well, while I grant the existence of lunacy, I like to look at things through an EV calculation, the expected value of a behavior, and what the one who is exhibiting that behavior hopes to get from it. I wonder, maybe it is just someone who needs to be entirely written off, but what in the world would motivate someone to falsely confess to a crime, especially when it would obviously lead to his immediate possessions being searched? And so someone confessing to a crime he didn't commit, guaranteeing that it would be discovered, the criminal activity that he was engaged in as a consequence. So are we entirely writing off George Zen as just a loon?
Zen was apparently known in the Orem, Provo area as kind of a kooky guy. Salt Lake County District Attorney Sam Gill, whose office had prosecuted Zen multiple times over the years, told the Salt Lake Tribune, quote, "Almost every political event you can think of, there was always George somewhere in the background listening," and described him as someone with, quote, "odd behavior challenges," who was, quote, "more of a gadfly than anything else." And Zen had a decade of minor arrests, and primarily for misdemeanors like trespassing, disorderly conduct, and interfering with law enforcement. And apparently he has a string of arrests dating back to the 1980s. So doing something like this, granted, it's bizarre, but it's not entirely out of character with his past behavior.
Well, what is especially noteworthy in this instance of bizarre behavior is how these other things presumably were premeditated, but this, assuming the official narrative is what it is, could not have possibly been premeditated. So he would have just witnessed, literally seconds before, going up to the police and saying that he was the shooter. He would have just witnessed the most brutal thing he's probably ever seen in his entire life, that the rest of the world has subsequently seen in Charlie Kirk's assassination. And so for him to have that traumatic event and all of the fallout from it, people screaming, people ducking down, the noise, the rush, to immediately in response to that make a bizarre claim where he took responsibility, it could, as Jeff has kind of alluded to just be an especially acute expression of his eccentric antisocial behavior, but it is one that illustrates a level of sociopathy, psychopathy, to not even seem to be moved or even be excited by that brutal murder that happened right in front of him.
Everybody grieves differently, I guess. Another point I want to flag is going back to October 2025, the New York Times reported that Joe Kent, who was at that time director of the National Counterterrorism Center, had been examining FBI files to investigate whether Robinson had support from someone else, a foreign power or another entity, and that this inquiry alarmed FBI Director Kash Patel and other senior officials who believed that Kent was overstepping into FBI territory. And since we've last covered this topic, in March 2026, Kent resigned his NCTC post, and he said publicly that he doubted that Robinson acted alone, and he said he would testify for the defense if called, and apparently is now under an FBI investigation for leaking classified information, including, according to Kent, a role in how Kirk's private text messages about Jewish donors eventually reached Candace Owens. So the little I know of Joe Kent, I certainly find him credible, and he seems to think that there was at least grounds for investigating the possibility that there was some sort of outside foreign involvement in the Kirk killing.
The FBI's jealous guarding of jurisdiction in this case is interesting in its own right. Asking Google AI if the FBI gets involved generally with murder cases, the response is no, the FBI does not immediately investigate murders because most homicides are state crimes. The primary responsibility falls to local or state law enforcement. The FBI only steps in if there is a specific federal interest, such as murders on federal land, which this was not, serial killings, which this was not, or crimes crossing state lines, which this was not. For the FBI to take a lead role or assist immediately, which is what the FBI did. There were FBI agents on the scene within minutes, within the hour. The case typically must involve federal jurisdiction, special circumstances, which are murders involving federal officials, foreign diplomats, or those tied to organized crime, or interstate crimes, cases where a suspect flees across state lines or involves a serial killer. And even in these situations, the Bureau typically has a hands-off assistant role that it provides. And so you could make the argument that Kirk is, by extension, a federal official, or at least a close ally of the President of the United States, and so the top government official in terms of executive power. But if you are steel manning skepticism of the official narrative, it is convenient that after a day of local law enforcement searching for the weapon, it took over 12 hours to find the weapon, and at least as it was reported by a ostensibly very tainted source, but Candace Owens, that the FBI showed up, and about an hour after the FBI showed up, local law enforcement found the gun after more than 12 hours of searching unsuccessfully for it. The shooting happened at noon on September 10th. The announced discovery of the presumed murder weapon was made on the morning of September 11th at 7 a.m. And the discovery looks like it was made in the late hours of September 10th or the early hours of September 11th. So that would suggest about 12 hours of a search for the weapon by state and local law enforcement, which, in light of the summation of the location of the murder weapon, what raises my eyebrows anyway. Here's the description that Claude provides. Quote, "It," that is the rifle, "was found very close by, not far off campus at all, just across the road from the shooting building. The rifle was found in a small patch of woods on UVU's own campus, northeast of the Lucy Center, the building he fired from, and just across Campus Center Drive from it, the same road he was seen sprinting across on surveillance footage right after the shooting. According to Fox News' law enforcement sourcing, police found the rifle wrapped in a towel and hidden in a small patch of woods just a few feet from where Robinson is believed to have crossed the street after fleeing the rooftop. So this wasn't some far-flung dump site. It was essentially still part of the immediate crime scene. He shot from the rooftop, ran across the roof, dropped to the ground, sprinted across one road, and stashed the gun in trees within feet of that road crossing, all still on or immediately adjacent to campus. For scale, the rooftop to target distance itself was 410 feet with a 68-foot vertical drop, so the rifle drop point was likely only a few hundred feet total from where Kirk was shot, well within the same immediate campus footprint, not a separate remote location, end quote. And Claude, it should be mentioned, is very much tilted in favor of the official narrative. It just didn't understand that this is why I was asking the question from a skeptical perspective, that it gave me an answer that does make it very curious that this gun was in an obvious place where it was known that Robinson had ran from, and police and state law enforcement had been looking for the weapon for 12 hours, that it took that long to find it. Suggests either bad luck up until the FBI came to assist, or incompetence, or something else.
So back to this preliminary hearing. It was the first time that Erica Kirk and Charlie's parents were in the same room as Robinson since his arrest, and about 24 of Kirk's friends, family, and political allies attended across the week, including Donald Trump Jr., Jack Posobiec, and Utah Senator Mike Lee. So summarizing the state's evidentiary case, surveillance footage placed Robinson on campus 4 times on September 10th. Investigators recovered a screwdriver, shoe prints, and what they described as a, quote, sniper perch, end quote, on the roof of the Lossy Center with a direct line of sight to the stage. Footage appeared to show a figure crossing that rooftop, dropping to the roof's edge, and fleeing on foot afterward. A bolt-action Mauser 98 rifle, which was supposedly a gift from Robinson's grandfather, was found wrapped in a towel in a nearby wooded area, as we discussed. And there was ammunition recovered, which bore engravings including, "Hey fascist, catch." Investigators recovered 1 spent cartridge case alongside several unfired rounds, all cycled from the same bolt-action rifle. There was DNA recovered from the towel and the screwdriver, which came back listing Robinson and his roommate/romantic partner, Lance Twiggs, as possible contributors, but not an absolute match. And the state's forensic witness confirmed on cross-examination, meaning being cross-examined by the defense, that degradation in the samples meant some genetic material was lost. The results showed, quote, very strong support, end quote, for Robinson's DNA on the towel and screwdriver. And more than one person's DNA was present on parts of the rifle, including Robinson's father, who had given it to Tyler. The trigger and trigger guard were swabbed together as a single sample, and that combined sample contained genetic material from at least 4 people, along with signs of degradation, meaning that some of the genetic material had begun to break down. The analyst was asked about this degradation, and the analyst attributed the degradation to environmental factors like heat and humidity, not to anything about who touched the item or when. Degradation affects the readability of a mixed sample as a whole. It does not identify which contributor's portion is freshest or least handled, and she testified the lab's methods cannot establish when any DNA was deposited. And during cross-examination, the defense pressed the DNA analysis on the limits of that certainty, meaning the certainty that the DNA belonged to Tyler Robinson. And the witness agreed she could not call the results infallible or claim a 0 error rate, and she acknowledged that DNA can, in principle, be transferred by touch rather than direct contact with the evidence. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of the preliminary hearing was the video that was played of Lance Twiggs, recorded in April 2026. Lance Twiggs is was apparently Tyler Robinson's lover/roommate. And so investigators interviewed Twiggs the day after the shooting. And then Robinson told Twiggs in person that he had killed Charlie Kirk This is according to Lance Twiggs describing Tyler Robinson. Robinson, quote, started crying a little bit and said, quote, he wishes he hadn't done it, end quote. Prosecutors described a note Robinson allegedly left for Twiggs, referencing, quote, the opportunity to take out Charlie Kirk, and text messages in which Robinson said he'd grown tired of Kirk's rhetoric, the famous line, I had enough of his hatred. Some hate can't be negotiated out. Another big source of skepticism was directed at the language of the supposed text messages between Lance Twiggs and Tyler Robinson. The criticism or the skepticism was that the language did not sound at all what you would expect from 20-year-old white boys sending text messages with each other. And granted, the text messages are kind of archaic and melodramatic, but the more I learn about these two individuals, these were not normal white boys. They were into bizarre subcultures. They were gamers, socially awkward. I think actually it sounds, based on the information that comes out, it's Lance Twiggs seems like the weirder guy than Tyler Robinson. He was apparently involved in bizarre experiments in the apartment, and he was used a lot of drugs, including psychedelics, and for a while was just regularly intoxicated and seemed deranged. So and then they obviously had a skewed view of the world in general. With all that context, I don't find the text messages that hard to believe that they would write in this over-the-top, dramatic manner.
I do find it somewhat questionable because, as Jeff mentioned, they were allegedly ensconced in video game culture, which makes this sort of language seem even more out of place in its elevation and its formality. Because anyone who has been involved or has kids who are involved in online gaming culture, let's just say the level of text, the sophistication and the syntax, the language, the word choices, the vocabulary are all much more primitive and much less impressive than the alleged text that Robinson sent to Twiggs. And then if you listen to Twiggs' recorded testimony that Jeff was referencing there, he does not sound articulate or eloquent in the least. He stumbles through very basic questions with uhs and ums and single syllable answers. He doesn't sound like someone who just spins eloquent variations and talks about outfits and refers to people as my love. Now, the context of the situation could be that he's just nervous or that he prepped, although it doesn't say, you would think in that situation he would have prepped for the interview, but the delivery sounds like he's winging it, so I don't know exactly what is going on there. But you don't get the impression from his communication, that 20 minutes of communication, that he is especially sophisticated or eloquent in his writing style.
Zooming out a bit, if these conspiracy theories, or maybe that's a pejorative way to describe them, alternative theories or skepticism of the official narrative, if these were true, presumably the person most incentivized to bring them up would be the defendant, Tyler Robinson, and his defense attorneys. I guess unless you're saying that this is all part of the plan, that Tyler Robinson is the fall guy, he's the patsy, and so they're just kind of going through a kabuki theater of presenting just enough of a defense to keep the facade, the charade up, but they're not actually gonna reveal the conspiracy. But at least at face value, if Tyler Robinson is falsely accused, he's not the killer, he's put on trial to spend either the rest of his life in prison or be killed. Presumably his 3 defense attorneys that he has, whose, their professional obligation is to find and press any exculpatory theory. The fact that they're not pushing hardly any of these alternative explanations other than pushing back, as Candace Owens made a big deal out of, pushing back a little bit on the DNA evidence. But even that, if you watch the entire exchange, the thrust is very clearly that from the witness that the DNA evidence is compelling and that it clearly most likely is that of Tyler Robinson. So, for instance, the defense never argued that Tyler Robinson wasn't present. And I did watch one episode of Candace Owens' show, and I noticed that I don't know if she's retconning, but apparently even she has dropped this idea that Tyler Robinson was not present. Even she seems to acknowledge that he was present, versus I think for a long time, for months, she was adamant that there's no way to absolutely Tyler Robinson was never present at the university. So that's just kind of another broader point. It's like the moving goalposts. So the defense never argued that Robinson wasn't present. They didn't raise the explosives or the shaped charge allegations. They didn't even argue that the shot came from anywhere other than the rooftop. They didn't raise any issue or didn't suggest a second shooter. The only thing they really did was contest the statistical methodology behind the DNA findings. Now, that alone doesn't necessarily dismiss the skeptics' claim, but again, applying kind of a surface level reading of the situation, if all of this compelling, obvious evidence was available, that would raise a reasonable doubt as to Tyler Robinson's guilt. Presumably or his three defense attorneys, again, whose entire professional reputation, this is probably their most high profile case they've ever had and probably ever will have. It would be malpractice. It would violate their professional obligation to have such obvious defense for their client and to not even raise them. Now, maybe they're saving it for if this case actually goes to trial. Maybe they're gonna reveal some of this compelling evidence, or again, this is all part of the conspiracy and that they're either willing or unwilling pawns in a larger conspiracy.
Or a third option could be the one that we posited several months ago, that Tyler Robinson was involved in some way in a conspiracy that involved the murder of Charlie Kirk. He just wasn't the one who fired the weapon that delivered the fatal discharge to Charlie Kirk. And so if that is what actually happened, but he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, well, what has happened up to this point would all be consistent with that being the case.
Okay, maybe this is a good point then to ask you, what is I would think as much thought as you've given this and as much skepticism as you applied, you have some theory as to what actually happened, who was orchestrating this conspiracy, what was their end game, why involve, if the goal was to kill Charlie Kirk in this way, like why wouldn't they just have Tyler Robinson pull the trigger? Why would they need this convoluted scheme where he's only like a patsy and he's involved directly in the plot and the assassination, but he's not the one actually pulling the trigger? Like what is the theory of the case?
Well, I'm not going to pretend like I could paint exactly what would happen, but if we look at it, as I am fond of doing, from an EV perspective, if Tyler Robinson wants Charlie Kirk dead, he has, in this hypothetical different set of situations you're setting up there, he has two options to get him dead. He could either pull the trigger himself and condemn himself to murder, or he could be an accessory to the murder and Charlie Kirk ends up dead, but they can't prove that he was the one who actually pulled the trigger, and so his punishment is much less severe than it would have been if he would have pulled the trigger himself, and either way, Charlie Kirk ends up dead. I'm not saying that he expected to get off scot-free. There is an enormous cost that is going to be associated, that is going to be borne by those who commit these sort of revolutionary acts.
So you're saying that you think Tyler Robinson was ideologically, as he's being presented, as essentially a LGBT, tranny, far left person, but he didn't maybe have the wherewithal or the the ability to actually carry out the murder himself, but that he wanted to play his part, but he just didn't have the wherewithal or the constitution to actually pull the trigger, but he was willing to go up to that line, but he just wasn't capable of crossing that line?
Well, that's going to remain to be seen how this plays out. No, if he was calculating in a way that he wanted Charlie Kirk dead, if he's the one who pulls the trigger, the consequences are a lot worse for him than if he is involved in a conspiracy that can't be traced effectively.
Okay, so if he is convicted or pleads guilty and gets an extremely long sentence at the very least, or life sentence or death, then would that change your view of it? Would that make it less likely that, because if he ends up spending the rest of his life in prison, I guess your theory is predicated that Tyler participated in this, but ultimately he's going to be taken care of, and he's not going to face the same consequences he would if he had actually carried out the murder and been sentenced to life in prison or death.
Yeah, I think if he ends up being given the electric chair, if it's execution, then yeah, it's hard to make. I think the speculation entirely falls apart. If it's anything less than that, and especially if it's something significantly less than that, then that would be a pretty good indication that that was the price he would be willing to pay in his ideological parameters. That would be much less than actually pulling the trigger. And then, of course, there also is the question of the difficulty of doing something, of shooting someone with a single shot, instant kill from over 400 feet away in a location that has a lot of public scrutiny and their surveillance and security and all that. It's not like it's as easy as turning on a light switch. There is an enormous opportunity for error, and for someone to do it with a single shot is pretty impressive given the circumstances. More impressive than you might expect the average 19-year-old to be able to pull off.
Okay, so you think Tyler Robinson was there at the day, or at the day of the shooting, but that he wasn't the one who actually pulled the trigger, and then presumably, then you think that he's going to get off in some way. I guess what would be your prediction then? Because at face value, it looks like this, albeit extremely slow, this is apparently this preliminary hearing, this Judge Graff in Utah is not going to rule on the preliminary hearing until September, which is just outrageous. Again, this is a very low bar to proceed to a trial. This is just the probable cause hearing is just, as the name suggests, just to determine whether there's probable cause to proceed to a trial. It's not anywhere near the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. So, and the evidence has already, the preliminary hearing is done. All the evidence has been presented. The judge just needs to view the record of what's been presented and make a determination. The idea that he needs a month and a half is just absurd. But despite that, other than that, it does appear that the criminal case is proceeding more or less by the books. And so you think something's going to go awry. Like, do you have any idea? You think do you think he's going to walk? Is that what you're predicting?
My skepticism is just that. I try to point out the things that I'm skeptical of. Beyond that, it's just conjecture that I put no stake in and I wouldn't put any money on. Although we are talking about money, it is interesting that if you believe the official narrative, you can more than double your money right now. Polymarket has an open market on whether or not Tyler Robinson will be convicted of murder, and hit a plea deal of him admitting murder, that market resolves as a yes. And it's at 45% right now. So the people who are willing to put money on the line here by a slight edge, by a slight advantage, more of the smart money, or more of the money, we'll see if it's smart or dumb, more of the money is on Tyler Robinson not being convicted of murder here than is on him being convicted of murder. And I do, as has been made clear here many times, I am very much a market respecter, more so than what people say, more so even than polls, because that's where people have real skin in the game. And it looks like a lot of people smarter than me are skeptical of this as well. Or maybe they're dumber than me and they're skeptical of it as well. But if that's the case, then if you think it is so open and shut, it's free money on the table. You could make not just $500, you can make $20,000 on this.
I think I've gambled like once in my life, and I've never done anything like Predict It or Polymarket, but I am seriously considering putting some money on this, on the yes side of that. I'm going to look into, I want to look at the exact parameters and the language of the yes-no proposal. But if it is, I think I will probably put money on it. The aspect of the case that made me most skeptical was the ballistics. Why wasn't there an exit wound? And at the risk of speaking way outside my expertise or knowledge base, I'm going to delve into some ballistics. I did my best to research this, and Tyler Robinson allegedly used a 30-06 rifle, and there was some dispute over the type of ammunition that he used. And a lot of the skeptics were passing around video footage of watermelons being shot by the same type of or similar type of firearm that Tyler Robinson allegedly used. And the implication of the videos, in the videos, the watermelon exploded in a dramatic fashion, just completely exploded into a million pieces. And so the implication was that if a gunshot like this exploded a watermelon, well, why wouldn't Charlie's head have exploded in a similar way?
Because I can hear people potentially screaming out that that's a bit of a straw man. I don't think that the general expectation was that his head would have exploded like the watermelon, but that there would have been at least enough force to produce an exit wound, that the bullet wouldn't have just lodged into his neck and then been stopped by his spine and dissipated as it did, and subsequently there wouldn't be the existence of the miraculous neck that stopped the bullet and saved a bunch of innocent bystanders. That the PR person for Turning Point USA reported days after Charlie Kirk's murder. He said that the surgeon involved who saw Charlie Kirk was the one who told him that. So it could just be a PR guy trying to lift people's spirits in the wake of a very dark situation, but it is curious how it corresponds. It's not surprising that it fed conspiracy or skeptical theories, that it fed into the questions people had of how a high-powered rifle like that was able to be caught in someone's neck and not produce an exit wound anywhere else. And then the very people closest to Charlie Kirk and the organization that he led afterwards saying that it was a miracle that it didn't come out. Whereas, as Jeff's about to say, the prosecution's testimony is no, this is pretty common. It's not that unusual for a high-powered rifle to not come out depending on the type of bullet used. And so if that's the case, it's just an example of gratuitous lying for no reason on the part of Turning Point USA, but it doesn't mean that the official narrative about Tyler Robinson killing Charlie Kirk is incorrect.
So doing some research, there apparently is a distinction between different types. There, of course, are distinctions between different types of ammunition and bullets. And one of the big distinctions is between full metal jacket ammunition, which is built to hold together and pass through a target. And then there's expanding soft point ammunition built to do close to the opposite. And the ballistics evidence presented at the preliminary hearing indicated that the rifle recovered was loaded with hunting-style soft point ammunition, which is the kind that's sold for deer and elk. And that class of round of ammunition is specifically engineered to mushroom and fragment on impact, especially on striking bone, so that it dumps its energy into the target rather than carrying through it. And so a soft point round entering the neck at an angle and contacting the spine, producing a retained fragmented bullet, is routine in that scenario. And it's not an anomaly. And so again, the physical evidence shown at the July preliminary hearing is consistent with that. The fragments were described as deformed mushroom jacket and lead core pieces, which is the signature of an expanding soft point round, striking something dense, and it is not consistent with a full metal jacket round, which you would expect presumably an exit wound or a different sort of reaction, or a different sort of reaction than we saw when Charlie Kirk's neck was shot.
With a ruling on the preliminary hearing not expected for over a month, and the court case, if it goes to trial, expected to take upwards of a year, this is certainly not the last we'll be discussing the Charlie Kirk killing. Before we close off for today, I want to reclinate back to the task we gave to our AI friend to look through cases where there are Supreme Court cases where there is a partisan block split on both ends of a case. That is, there are liberal justices in the assent and the dissent, and also on that same case, that same ruling, there are conservative justices on the assent and on the dissent. Looking over the last few years, it looks like between 3 and 5% of cases end up with rulings going that way. So while the unanimous 9-0 is the plurality, the most common judgment, and in some ways is indicative of the court not necessarily being a small legislature, or at least it's a potential argument to push back against that, that could also be read as being indicative of a sort of legal Overton window where elites, of which all Supreme Court justices are definitionally part of, that the elite managerial class superstructure, where that superstructure has an Overton window that is on some issues nonpartisan in the sense that neither the conservatives nor the liberals think that there is an ideological advantage or some other kind of advantage in taking a position opposite their ideological counterparts. It could be read as indicative of the managerial state closing ranks in the face of legal questions that they want to dictate a full and unambiguous ruling on. By contrast, in cases where there are liberals on both sides of the issue and conservative justices on both sides of the issue, it is those quite rare cases that probably best argue for the existence of some nonpartisan in a political sense, and also the lack of elite opinion exclusivity on an issue or on a particular legal question. And it is those kinds of rulings that evidence the court operating in the way that the founding generation probably anticipated, or at least hoped for the court to render their judgments on the most contentious issues of the day. And finally, before we close out, I want to add a stadium-sized caveat to the assessment I made about the utility of prediction markets in allowing curious observers to suss out the realities that are coming down the pike in a way that is more accurate than punditry or even polling. But that caveat is what many people have identified as one of the most socially nefarious trends to have exploded over the last decade, and that is the world of sports betting. When it comes to statewide elections for president in a state like Mississippi, and it's a 95-5 market in favor of the Republican winning, you can take that to the bank. It's not 95 out of 100 times that is going to be the outcome. It's 100 out of 100 times. The market is giving reliable information you can take to the bank. But when it comes to sports contests, especially team games, there's just no way for that sort of certainty to be warranted at the professional level. Sports are exciting to people because the outcomes are unpredictable. Upsets happen all the time, and yet a much larger percentage of the population is more plugged into and aware of at least the basics of sports and players and games and schedules. And so a lot more money ends up going into sports betting, sports markets effectively, than goes into things like political markets. Just for a point of comparison here, this Tyler Robinson case that we're talking about, the poly market on the Robinson case has just under $250,000 traded in shares. That's a little less than $250,000 traded. In contrast, the winner of the World Cup, the soccer global tournament, has a staggering $4.3 billion, that's with a B, Dr. Evil, $4.3 billion traded. That is, there is 1,600,000% more dollars being traded in the market on the World Cup winner than there is on the market for whether or not Robinson will be convicted of homicide. And despite all of that money in the World Cup market, the likely winner has bounced all over the place. I was aware of the World Cup taking place, but I had no idea as to what teams were involved, the brackets, or anything like that. I took my first look when the tournament had progressed to the semifinal stage. There were 4 teams remaining, and in those semifinal matches, in both cases, the team that the markets expected to win lost. So that is a random snapshot of these markets not having a lot of value. It is a random snapshot, yes, but also an extremely lucrative compared to any of the political markets that have a lot more utility, but involve a lot less money being spent overall, a lot less money being lost overall. And so the point of this is to endorse the utilization, the usage, the value add from political markets, while simultaneously warning against putting any stake in sports betting markets. There are a lot of people going broke, getting addicted to sports betting. I suspect there are far fewer people, if any at all, going broke, putting money on political markets. The smart money is in the political markets. The fanatical money, and that is what the word fan, like as in sports fan, that's what it's short for. It's short for the word fanatic. The fanatical money is in the sports gambling markets. So that was my major point in bringing this up at the end. And the minor point is the self-indulgent opportunity to point out that of the 4 teams that were remaining in the semifinals, all 4 of those teams are among the select few blessed countries to be included in what is inarguably the greatest soccer video game ever made, if not the greatest sports game ever made of all time. And that is, of course, Nintendo's World Cup for the original 8-bit console system. France, Spain, England, and Argentina. And if that video game taught us anything, it's that Argentina is definitely going to win the World Cup. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.